If you're listening now, in the thin hours when the world still presses its face against the radio, know this. The map we learned at school is a corpse. The rivers we traced with our fingers are gone or poison scarred. The mountains are skinned where fires chewed at their bones. The coastlines have moved like grief, some swallowed whole by water, others left dry and sun-cracked, like fruit left out too long. The sky hasn't been honest in years. It hangs low and bruise-dark most days, a dome of dust and heat that makes the sun a rumor. Sometimes it burns orange, the color of old warning lights. Sometimes it rains with a metallic hiss that strips paint and patience. The storm seasons come without warning now, folding into each other. A wildfire that turns to ash, and then a wind that brings rain laced with salt and chemicals. We learn to read the sky the way old people read the Bible, for signs and punishments for small mercies. Cities turned inward and then broke. Downtown was a canyon of glass and metal until the glass fell away and left only skeletons. Skyscrapers tilt like tired teeth. I walked across a bridge once that used to hum with traffic. Now it sags toward a riverbed so dry you can read the names carved into the concrete years ago. Subways became tombs or tin farms, depending on where the water went. The malls, those temples of plenty, are scaffolds and shelters, walls stripped of branding, floors carpeted with memories. You can still find a leaf trapped in a storefront window, yellowed under dust. It makes me think of the small things that survived, like stubborn yellow. There are places where the ocean ate the coast and left salt plains that glitter like snow under the wrong sun. There are places where it raged one night and never stopped being angry. Towns that were drowned while people slept, their church bells still dredged up in shipping nets. Where factories once churned profit, rust now spreads like a soft disease. The machines are quiet. The hum that used to be the background noise of civilization, traffic, air conditioning, the faint drone of a distant plane, that hum is rare as moonlight. Government is a memory in many places, a word people use when they want to remind themselves there once was order. Some regions still try to stitch a semblance back together. Council huts in old city halls, tribunals that meet under tarps. But most administrations slid into whatever they could, into bunkers, into black market deals, into the hands of whoever had bullets and batteries. Borders mean very little. What matters is water, fuel, a working radio transmitter, and a compass that still points north. Survivor groups cluster the way barnacles do on a hull, tight and territorial. There are the gardeners, a loose confederation of people who hoard soil and hope, turning rooftops into small, stubborn farms. They barter seeds for medicine and stories. There are the keepers, who guard clean wells and charge admission in labor or loyalty. Then the scavengers, of course, the ones who go out with masks and lists and come back with the day's spoils and the night's ghosts. Some scavenger crews have names painted on their rigs. Others operate in silence and leave only a smell of diesel and old fear. Rogue factions filled the vacuum government left like opportunists on a broken road. Raider packs strike transit lines for canned goods. Religious bands preach the end was deserved and that survival is sanctification. There are mercantile enclaves now, once cities, now gated markets where people trade batteries for stories and canned peaches for a missing molar. Law, where it exists, is local and often violent. Justice is whatever the person with the loudest gun says it is. Institutions that once promised permanence either adapted or died. Hospitals became triage hovels, then ration centers. Some doctors retreated into networks of clinics with composting toilets and second-hand X-ray machines. Universities turned into archives, campuses that house salvaged knowledge and bitter people who keep the lights on for the sake of remembering. Churches are shelters, schools are training grounds, and libraries smell like mold and solemnity. We still steal books from them like contraband because a page is a small defiance. What persists are the radios. Odd, right? Machines built to connect now hold whole communities together. A working transmitter is more valuable than a stockpile of grain. Radios carry warnings, barter calls, the names of lost children, the static lullabies of people who refuse to be anonymous. That's where I am tonight. In a low-lit shack with a rusted generator that coughs and a spool of copper wire that's been patched so many times it could be a skeleton. I broadcast because voices keep a kind of map of who we were and who we might still become. The land itself has learned to be cruelly inventive. Drought cracked what soil remained into puzzle pieces, gullies made overnight where none had been. Fires ate the underbrush and then the canopy, so wind carries embers now like seeds. In colder regions, winters came in new, violent cycles, flash freezes that snap bones of trees and people alike. When the earth shifts, ruin follows. Infrastructure rots, supply lines fray. Food is not something you buy anymore. It's something you coax out of old hands and older soil. And yet, even here, things edge toward life. Moss on an abandoned statue. A clump of wheat sprouting between slabs of collapsed highway. A child's laugh swallowed by wind and then heard again. We live with that double edge, the knowledge that much is lost, and the stubborn sense that some small, stubborn things will not let go. That's the world I know the most now. A cartography of loss and pockets of stubbornness, of ruins that double as refuge, of people who still trade names and songs when they ought to be trading bullets. We sleep with one eye open, and we wake listening for the next sound. The approach of rain, the thud of a scavenger's boot, or another voice through the static. Anxiety is the currency we can't afford to lose, and uncertainty is the sky under which we make our plans. I turn the dial slow, like I'm stroking the spine of an old friend. The needle clicks over frequencies and static folds into something that almost sounds like a voice. That small, almost is enough most nights. My name is Jonah Rays. Once, that name fit a man who wore a suit on a Monday and fixed a stubborn leak in the roof on a Saturday. Once, my hands knew the weight of a child's bike and the softness of a woman's hair. Those things have become memories with edges, sharp and comforting at the same time, and I keep them in a tin box under the cot beside my generator. I take them out sometimes and hold them until the dust in the room settles into quiet. That's how you keep from losing everything. You honor the weight of it. Now I am a voice that wakes up the dead. I broadcast from a shack at the top of a collapsed radio tower where the wind tastes like iron, and every night the stars come down to look in through the holes. In the day, I check the antenna lines, lash things with baling wire, and walk the route between my water catchment and the rooftop garden. At dusk, I prime the generator, a temperamental old thing with a name. I gave it because naming keeps loneliness at bay. I have learned to listen to the cough of a machine like a friend's breathing. When it's good, it purrs and holds station through the night. When it's bad, the hum stalls and I go out with a wrench to make deals with a stubborn carburetor. Survival, for me, is a ledger. I keep lists of what's owed, what's traded, what must be preserved. Water is always the top line. I have a rain drum fashioned from an old satellite dish and a tarp. I clean the first flow, the one that carries roof dust, into a separate container used only for cleaning tools. The filtered water goes through a makeshift still sometimes, when the chemical taste creeps in, and I keep charcoal and sand in jars for slow filtration. Food is for barter and dreaming. Flat loaves of composite flour that crack at the edges, smoked fish caught from a pool that once was a pond, handfuls of beans traded for a half hour of a scavenger's escort. I know how to fish with braided wire and a bent nail. I know how to fashion a snare from shoelaces and patience. I learned how to mend a torn lung with suction and prayer when the clinic ran out of gauze. That last skill I hope never to use again. But the practicalities, the tins and the traps and the filtered water, are only half of what keeps me alive. The rest is the broadcast itself. I am, selfishly and soberly, attached to the idea that someone somewhere needs to hear a voice that remembers the old names for things. A transmitter is a lifeline and a confessional. People call in with names of wells, with warnings about raiders, with the small poems they find in discarded books. They say the simplest things. My sister's name is Maria. She left this morning. We'll trade canned peaches for bandages. Tonight there's a fire on the ridge. They say them with the same cadence some used to say goodbye. When a call comes through, I write it down, I repeat it, I check the frequency, and I make sure the message is not lost to the scrub of static. I do this because somewhere between those messages, something like a map of us survives. I carry losses like small stones in my pocket. Anna, my wife, had a laugh that used to break straight through the gray. She taught our daughter how to braid her hair in the summer, before the storms took the electricity away for good. Mara, that was our girl, liked to collect bottle caps and line them up like little planets. I still have a cap with a blue stripe she painted on it. I turn it under my thumb and imagine her fingers reaching for it. They are gone. The night they left, I thought the world would catch fire and all the clocks would stop. It didn't work that way. Time kept moving because the world is cruel in its continuity. Guilt is a constant companion. I survived when they did not. I have replayed that night in my head until it is a film with frayed edges. The decision to leave the car where it jammed in mud, the argument that was more fear than words, the choice to run toward the high ground. I justify and then unjustify myself. Sometimes survivors find a religion in blame. I have none to offer but the confession into the microphone, I am Jonah, I am listening, and I am sorry. Saying it into the static is a ritual that keeps my hands busy and my heart from hardening. Trust is a complicated ledger too. I learned early that people change shape when hunger stands at the door. There are faces you can read, the ones with steady hands and eyes that hold you, and faces that are maps of desperation. I have been taken advantage of. I have also been saved by strangers who arrived bearing clean water and no questions. The network that orbits my little tower runs on membranes of reciprocity. An extra can of meat for a night watch, a box of ammo for pipe repairs, a story for a night's labor. I keep a list of names who owe me and who I owe. That list is a moral geography I return to when I get tired of the larger world. People tell me I am selfish for broadcasting. Why waste fuel on your nostalgia? One man called from the north. He had a point. The generator drinks gasoline in gulps and the barrels are finite. But each time a voice replies to mine, a laugh, a sob, a grocery list whispered like a prayer, the world tightens at the edges. The broadcast stitches a seam between the wreckage and the possibility of community. I have rerouted scavenger routes through messages, warned a school that a storm was coming, stopped a needless fight by repeating an old folk song someone's grandmother would know. Small things, not enough to fix anything wholesale, but enough to keep wheels turning. Sometimes, in the lull between transmissions, I let myself remember what life felt like when it was ordinary. I remember the mundane bravery of making coffee in the morning, and the small, ridiculous joy in the steam that used to fog the kitchen window. I remember Mara's clumsy attempts to whistle. Those memories are not just pain, they are the reason I continue. If memory were a seed, I would plant it in the ground until it grew into a tree that bore fruit. That fruit would be a world where a child could whistle without thinking about whether the next breath was their last. I am not a hero. Heroes are tidy. I am messy and patient. I have patched things together with duct tape and stubbornness. I take solace in crafts, soldering a broken circuit with a spoon, weaving dead coax into a makeshift antenna that catches a signal across 3 counties, patching a jacket with leather from an old book cover, because it fits the hole in the elbow better than anything else. These acts are small, but they add up to defiance. Defiance is how you refuse to be reduced to a statistic. There are nights when despair wears itself like a coat, and it is heavier than the winter we used to know. On those nights, I read names off the list of listeners and imagine what their faces might look like under the moon. I tell them about the garden on the roof, about the stubborn lettuces that punch their green heads through a ragged patch of soil, and some caller will respond with the name of a seed I need. I tuned my life into a trade route of language. People send me stories and I send back coordinates for a clean well. We barter empathy as surely as we barter canned beans. The hardest thing is the not knowing. You can prepare for storms, for blight, for a broken generator, but you cannot prepare for the slow collapse of expectation. The idea that the future might look like the past. I keep a small book where I write plans, big foolish plans and microscopic practical ones. Build a windmill from scrap. Teach the children in the valley how to seam a shirt. Repair a school roof. These are blueprints, half of them likely to fail, but they are my stake in a future I am not sure I deserve. When I sign off at dawn, I do not say goodbye. I say, hold on, because that is the truth. Hold on until the sun moves an inch. Hold on until a call comes through. Hold on until someone remembers a joke you used to tell. The radio is a thin skin stretched between us, and as long as I have breath and a wire to hold it taut, I will keep it singing. So yes, I survive with tools and rationing and second-hand wisdom. But more than that, I survive with a radio and the belief that voices matter. If you listen hard enough, you can hear the way people patch the world with words. And if you are listening now, know this. I see you. I know your names, and I will say them into the dark until the night breaks or the batteries die. Either way, I will keep the light on for however long I'm able. They told us the weather would get stranger. We heard the scientists on old broadcasts, the politicians with their smoothing words, the NGOs with their charts. We heard it as background noise until it stopped being background and started knocking on our doors. Now the strange is the only language the sky speaks. The crisis we face is not one thing. It's a litany of small deaths that add up to the end of the map. For 5 years the rain stopped behaving like rain. It stopped coming when it used to, and when it did come it arrived like an accusation. Too much at once, then none for months. Rivers that had been steady since my grandfather's time ran the way fingernails bleed. Lakes roasted into salt flats. The ground, having been stripped of its moisture, turned to the kind of powder that fills your lungs and makes your eyes feel like sand. That powder lies on the city like a second skin. Then the fires came. Where drought had left kindling, heat found fuel. Old growth that had held water like a bank now bled sap and ash. Fires leapt highways and ate neighborhoods and left open wounds in the countryside. The smoke sat on us like a heavy shawl. It married the dust and made every breath more expensive. After the fires, the hills had nothing to hold rain. When rain finally arrived, it ran off like an insult and carved gullies where roads used to be. Floods in their sudden, efficient cruelty erased whole settlements in an hour. I watched a river change direction in a single night and take with it a bakery I used to buy bread from. Science has a blunt way of explaining this. More heat in the atmosphere means more energy for storms. Warmer seas pump more moisture into the air, which can make storms heavier and wetter when they hit land. Warmer land evaporates faster, deepening droughts. Melting ice reduces the planet's reflectivity, the albedo, so the surface holds more heat, which feeds back into warming. Permafrost thaw releases gases that push the thermostat further. We weren't surprised so much as we were punished for being slow to change. The result is an unstable climate machine that makes extremes the norm. But the physics are cold comfort when a neighbor knocks on your door starving. The crisis is social as well as environmental. Food systems that depended on steady rains and long supply chains collapsed in sequence. Farms failed, harvests were patchy, trucks stopped moving because roads were impassable, or because the drivers had been taken by disease or by the temptation of easier pickings. The factories that processed food slowed, and then stopped when fuel became as rare as a clean shirt. Once the networks broke, local production mattered more than distant logistics. That is why places with small rooftop gardens and cisterns suddenly became islands of relative plenty, and why they became targets. I'd like to pretend I met the crisis with some grand plan. I didn't. For a long time, my survival strategy was improvisation dressed up as competence. But the crisis forced me to systematize improvisation. Here is what I learned, the hard lessons written in the margins of my life. Water is currency, prayer, and the central problem. Wells have run low or been poisoned by runoff and chemical spills. Reservoirs filled with sediment and algae turn green with bloom and smell like old pennies. A single contaminated water source can kill a whole cluster of people if they drink without testing. So we learn to do the small, tedious things that add up. Catch everything. Tarps rigged to gutters, satellite dishes turned into catchment funnels, buckets placed at roof seams. The first leaders off any roof are the worst, full of dust and bird droppings, and must be separated and used only for tool washing. Filter and disinfect. Charcoal, sand, and cloth make a slow but effective filter. Boil when possible. I carry iodine tabs and a small stock of bleach. For long-term use, a solar still can extract water from dirty sources though its yield is low. Still, if your life depends on a liter a day, you make friends with slow devices. Guard it, mark cisterns, rotate watch schedules around water storage, and keep inventories. A lost barrel of fuel is easier to replace than a poisoned tank of water is to forgive. Food became local and mechanical again. We relearned fermentation and smoking. Grains are stored in sealed containers away from vermin. Legumes are rotated in and out. Wild edibles are treasured but treated with caution because drought changes plant chemistry. Root crops that survive dry spells, turnips, certain hardy tubers, became staples where they could be grown. Rooftop gardens, compost tea, and seed exchanges are the new market. Fuel and power fuel is the bone beneath everything. The generator I nurse drinks gasoline like a child drinks water. Solar panels are precious but shaded by the ash and dust. They need constant cleaning. Batteries sulfate and die. I spend half my scavenging runs looking for parts. An inverter, a length of copper wire, a module for a regulator. When you lose power, communications die with it. That is why the groups that still control power nodes hold the keys to negotiation. They are bargaining with light and with life. Healthcare clinics either collapsed or became sanctuaries with triage ability. Antibiotics are precious. Vaccines, where they existed, had been distributed unevenly in the early panic. As a result, outbreaks flared in pockets. Cleanliness is the most effective medicine we have left. Boil water for wounds. Use bleach to disinfect surfaces. Keep latrines far from water stores and isolate when someone shows signs of infection. I learned how to suture in the dark and how to make a poultice from scavenged herbs when bandages ran low. Society and security, the social fabric frayed. Institutions that once mediated conflict were gone. We now police ourselves with agreements and with fear. Raider groups organize like corporations with a single profit motive. Goods, they hit convoys, they take what they need, often leaving only a trail of humiliation and loss. In contrast, cooperatives, the gardeners, share surplus seed in exchange for labor. They set watches and trade intelligence. Both models persist. Both are fragile. Encounters define everything. A few months back, a crew from the keepers came down the ridge, women and men with sunburned forearms and the smell of compost and oregano, asking for help when a well had been choked by algae. We worked together for 3 days, cleaning filters and flushing lines. In that time, we shared a pot of real coffee, and someone from their group taught me how to graft a tomato vine to withstand heat stress. Those days are why I keep broadcasting. Not every encounter ends in blood. We can barter knowledge as well as food, but there are other encounters. A raider strike hit a convoy I had advised over the air, a mistake I replay like a loop of guilt. We had marked a route as safe because the last time it was clear, it wasn't that time. Men with masks and blackened eyes appeared out of a dry arroyo and took the cargo and 2 lives. I learned then that information is ammunition. Shout a route, and you might be gifting it to someone who will use it as a map for violence. There are nights I don't broadcast certain things for that reason. Why is survival getting harder each day? Because the coupling of environmental stress and social collapse creates feedback loops. As resources drop, Competition increases, which damages infrastructure further. Damaged infrastructure reduces resource flows more, making scarcity worse. The cost of repair in parts, in knowledge, in fuel grows. You can fix a pipe once. The second time you need the machine shop and the shop closed when the power went. Replacement parts are rarer. Expertise walks away or dies. Over time, small issues compound. A single broken water pump can lead to a village abandoning its well, increasing the pressure on neighboring sources until they too are strained. And then there's the uncertainty of the weather itself. We used to have a calendar. Now the sky gives us warnings in hours. A forecast is not a distant plan. It is an immediate survival checklist. A dust storm might be hours of choking gray, followed by a sudden cold snap that kills the last of the tomatoes. A wildfire might push ash into the aquifer, turning the water a chemical color we can taste on our tongues. The variability stresses crops, kills livestock, and makes planning a kind of cruel joke. There are limitations that feel like a slow strangling. Fuel and batteries are finite and require scavenging runs that risk life. Medical supplies are limited and subject to hoarding. Seed diversity is shrinking because seed banks require climate-controlled storage, and many of those systems failed. Knowledge itself, the know-how to repair a carburetor, to splice a coax line, to grow a particular heirloom bean in heat, is now distributed in human networks rather than institutions, and that knowledge travels slowly. So we adapt as best we can. On practical levels, that means redundancy. We don't rely on a single water source. We have multiple, and we rotate them so none get overdrawn. We keep spare parts for the generator, and we trade lessons in barter for tools. We cultivate social practices that reduce conflict. Rotating watch schedules, agreed-upon trade routes, and signal codes, so that approaching convoys can be identified without giving away cargo to anyone listening who shouldn't. On psychological levels, we create rituals. We have a 2-minute silence at dusk for people we lost that week. We read names over the radio, and we light small fires that smell of cedar and hope. Rituals are not solutions to climate change, but they are scaffolding for the human heart. Without them, people fall apart and become easier to manipulate. I also give actionable advice on air, the lean, concrete kind that preserves life. I tell listeners how to test water simply. Smell it, look at it, boil a cup and watch for unusual residues. If in doubt, boil, filter, and then disinfect. I tell them how to mark safe routes with natural signals so only those who know the code can find them. I teach basic first aid over the air. How to pack a wound, how to improvise a splint, when to consider evacuation. It's not glamorous instruction, but when someone calls later to say, "You saved my child's life with that splint," the transmitter feels less like a luxury and more like a hospital. All of this, the science, the barter, the watch schedules, comes down to a simple fact. The crisis is as much about social will as it is about weather. Water and fuel are material limits, but the choices people make about sharing, about trust, about organizing, determine whether communities crumble or hold. The climate does not care if we decide to cooperate. The climate only cares about physics. We, however, can choose to build institutions that weather storms at a human scale, even if national institutions have failed. Tonight, as I speak into the dark, there's a new worry on the horizon. The weather models we can still patch together, ragged, human-made charts scribbled on paper and radio calls, suggest an atmospheric river of heat and moisture is slamming into the coast. That means wind, rain in torrents, flash floods, and the kind of mudslides that swallow entire neighborhoods. It also means contaminated runoff, worst of all, because the chemicals of the old world wash through the new. We prepare as best we can. Strap down tarps, move barrels to higher ground, secure batteries in waterproof cases, and distribute sandbags. But even as we prepare, we know some things can't be saved. The crisis will ask for more than we have. It will demand decisions that leave guilt in the footprints. We will be forced to prioritize children over elders in some cases, to choose between saving a generator or fueling a truck that might bring medicine. These are the moral fractures that splinter communities faster than any storm. I tell people this not to frighten them, but because panic is easy. Preparation is slow, dull, and lonely work. If you want to survive, you turn fear into a tool. Inventory, trade, teach, and secure. You say no to one risky call so someone else may live. You keep lists and you keep watch. You invest in small redundancies, a spare filter, an extra jar of iodine, a second pair of boots. You teach a child to mend a jacket and to recognize the sky. The crisis is ongoing. It is a math problem where the variables keep changing. But it has edges. There are things you can do that reduce the chance your name will be whispered one day as someone who could have tried harder. That is the truth I send into the night. We cannot stop the weather alone, but we can make the difference between losing everything and keeping a little. And sometimes, a little is all you need to begin again. They say crises arrive like weather, a slow pressure change that you notice only when everything has shifted and you can't breathe the same way anymore. For weeks the pressure at the edges of our life has been rising. Barrels that once held 3 months' worth of fuel now count for a week. Cans that used to be traded for a story are now hoarded like family silver. The generator coughs more every night, and the sputter under its breath has become a metronome for my worry. The garden on the roof is where you can chart decline like a tide line. 2 summers ago the lettuces were stubborn things of riotous green. Last season they browned at the edges and went soft as tissue in an accelerated kind of death. This year, between the heat waves and the acid rains that came fast, water so sharp it makes you taste metal after a sip, half the beds failed. We reseeded with the hard beans the gardeners swore by, and we propped the tomato vines with broom handles and baling twine. But even the grafted stock from the keepers started to show stress. Roots that had anchored life for a decade twisted and died in the salt-permeated soil. Each wilted leaf was a small, private funeral. Fuel has become my obsession. I can feel it in the way my hands hover over the barrels, as if I might stroke the label back into being. Last month the convoy that used to bring a drum of petrol every 6 weeks stopped coming. The drivers are few now, older men who remember when roads were roads, not puzzles to be solved with brute force. We tried to arrange escort with the keepers. We pooled cans and offered watch rotations. That convoy never reached us. A detour turned into ambush. What was left at the end were scorch marks and a length of blue tarp. I still replay the call I made into the static when I heard the convoy come over the ridge. North Ridge clear, I said. My voice sounded younger then. I did not know then that clear is a dangerous word. The raiders are different now. They aren't disorganized bands of desperate men scraping for scraps. That was the cruel maturation of this collapse. Desperation breeds entrepreneurship. Raiders learn to run logistics, scouts, traps, diversion teams. They take what is mobile first, fuel, batteries, anything with copper on it. Then they return for things harder to move. Seeds, well filters, even people with useful skills. They learned our language, our trade winds, and they listen to our airwaves the same way we do. Information is a currency as lethal as a bullet, which is why the rumor that arrived on a cracked frequency, a voice like old paper folding itself, felt like a match near dry tinder. Bluewell, the caller said. The name was soft and impossible. Bluewell Spring, works, clean. South off Highway 7, coordinates 42 point something north, water like the old world. Someone else cut in right after, voice sharper, clipped. Don't go, it's bait. The keepers tried the same in 27, lasted 2 days before the packs took the pump. An argument erupted across channels like birds fighting over a carcass. For every claim there was a counterclaim. That is how hope and fear have always argued, with rumors and rebuttals and the occasional heartbreaking truth in the middle. I sat with that name like a rock in my mouth for 3 nights. Bluewell. The sound of it filled the radio room like a promise and a trap at once. My ledger told me the sensible thing. Hoard what I had, fortify what worked, keep the transmitter alive. The part of me shaped by grief, and by Mara's little painted bottle cap wanted to believe it with a violence that felt almost holy. If a clean spring existed, you could feed more people. You could start a small mechanism of return, filters that worked. A pump that ran, children who wouldn't cough ash in their sleep. It could be a seed, literal and metaphoric. It could be the place where the map became worth redrawing. But there are rules in the new world. Rule 1. Anything that sounds like salvation is a beacon. Rule 2. If you shout salvation into the dark, someone with bad intent will hear and come with hunger in their hands. I had broadcasted before with good intentions and paid for the collateral. That guilt is a slow poison. If I wanted to investigate Bluewell, I could not do it loudly. I could not call for volunteers and name the road and the time and the color of the second telephone pole. I would have to be careful, surgical with information, and that meant putting faith in a few people who had chosen to show their faces to me and keep them. Lena volunteered first without fanfare. She was one of the gardeners who taught rooftop grafting. When she speaks about plants, her voice is soft but certain. She showed up with a bandana and 3 jars of compost tea, and 3 whole sentences into the conversation she offered to come with me on a scouting run. I had always relied on her for quiet competence. She could check a cistern without flinching at the smell, and she could move with the kind of stealth that comes from years of up-rooftop work. Her eyes, when she looked at me, were honest. If there's a spring, Jonah, it could change everything here, she said. If it's a trap, you'll need someone who will watch your back. Mateo of the Keepers offered muscle and a scrounged map. He arrived in a truck that had seen better days and smelled like compost and old coffee. Mateo's crew ran a small purifier on barter for labor. They had parts and a crank pump that could be cobbled into something useful if given the right fittings. He was pragmatic to the bone. If you go, he said, we go with the night. We take no lights until we're at the coordinates. We leave the truck hidden and move on foot if needed. We cache fuel. We do not broadcast. Then there was Silas, a scavenger with a reputation for knowing the routes no index could hold. He had a scar across one eyebrow and a laugh that started as a smirk. He said he'd been near Highway 7 a year back, saw a structure half sunk that might be the thing the caller meant. His story changed at the edges. He said Bluewell might be an old municipal treatment plant that had a sealed membrane system, something that could be salvaged. Or it could be a crusted-out well with a pump someone left running and a guard who likes the sound of his own voice, he said. Either way, it's worth a look. Inside me, the ledger stacked like a nervous clerk tallying risk. Transmitters to watch, rolls to hand off. The generator's remaining fuel that could power the radio through 2 more nights if rationed. If I left, who would be the voice for the people who only have the radio as a tether? If I stayed, could I live with the knowledge that I didn't at least verify a rumor that could save more than a handful? Guilt is a ledger that multiplies if you allow it. We planned with the slowness of people who cannot afford haste. We cached fuel 3 miles out, buried under a tarp and disguised with dead branches. We packed water in bladder reservoirs that could be split into smaller jugs if needed. We loaded tools, a pump wrench, a spare regulator, lengths of hose rigged in a coil like a sleeping snake. We layered our travel. The truck would take us to the last road that still bore tracks. Then we would proceed on foot to avoid ambushes at choke points. We agreed on hand signals, on a quiet code for retreat, and on a single contingency. If we encountered more than a dozen people armed and not willing to parley, we would withdraw and secrete the map. The days before we left felt like the breathing before a dive. I recorded messages to be broadcast in my absence. Emergency procedures, water testing instructions, a tagline to reassure listeners that the station was under Lena's care. I trained her on the choke points of the generator, where to siphon fuel if needed, how to use the crank in an emergency. She was quick, she was patient. When she asked me if I would come back, my answer lodged in my throat as a modest dare. I'll be back before the dusk gets in the ears of the first dawn. Not everyone approved. A caller hoarse from coughing, voice like gravel, accused me on the air of grandstanding. You'll lead them into a trap, Jonah. You'll be the one people point to when the barrels are empty. The accusation hurt because it was smaller and truer than the other things that kept me awake. I could have kept the transmitter singing, hoarded the little gas we had for the hum of constant reassurance. It would have been the safer moral calculus. But safety had become an argument for passivity, and passivity had been a luxury for others to have died on. We left at the hour between night and the first bruise of dawn, when heat has not yet found its voice. The air was clean in that small window. You could smell the country in a way that felt like a memory. The truck rode rough and quiet. We moved like people who had rehearsed possibility until it was a muscle. The road toward Highway 7 is not a single place. It's a geography of choices. A ridge to skirt, a dry arroyo to cross, a line of scrub to flank. Silas knew the flanks. He pointed and we followed, boots whispering over ground that never forgives noise. On the second day, the sky changed and made a decision we did not expect. Clouds boiled up fast and dark, not the soft wash we counted on, but iron-thick curtains that moved like muscle across the land. The electricity in the air felt like a threat. A wind rose that smelled faintly of salt and new chemicals, the kind of smell that means runoff is coming from somewhere the ocean took. We made for cover and then saw the line, a column of dust on the far ridge, not from our truck but from movement. Raiders. They moved with intent. We watched through a screen of mesquite as their vehicles, patched and plated, cut across a low valley, guns mounted, flags that were little more than rags but which had meaning once you learned their language. One vehicle carried a pump on its bed, a thing that spoke of planning. They don't pillage without aim. They take what will let them hold. For a moment the decision hung in the air like a bell. Go forward and risk walking into a net, turn and run, and possibly let a well slip away to someone who will close it behind them. That was the moment where hope and fear both felt like hands on my chest. If Bluewell was real, it would have to be a place we either secured or left to someone harsher. If it wasn't, we would have wasted lives on a false trail. I could feel Mara's cap in my pocket like a hot coal. I thought of the messages I had recorded for Lena, the voice I had trained her to be. I thought of the names I repeat into the mic to keep them alive. We took a flank. It was reckless and it was careful. We skirted along a dry wash, moving slow, digging feet into sand to muffle our noise. The dust column on the ridge watched us like a sunburned eye. We were ghosts with purpose. The closer we got, the more the world rearranged itself into potential catastrophes. Tracks showed signs of recent traffic. A length of fencing had been knocked down and dragged. There were signs someone had tried to hide a cache and then left in a hurry. We began to find things that pricked the imagination. A child's shoe half buried in ash, a stack of plastic crates overturned, a weather-beaten sign for BLUEWELL Municipal, half buried and pointing to a concrete channel that might once have carried treated water. Then we saw it, not the idyllic spring in some utopian sense, but a compound, a low concrete structure with pipes like ribs and a yard ringed by makeshift barricades. Someone had indeed set a pump. Someone had been working on membranes, on blue-tinted filters that sagged like the last breath of a whale. But they weren't alone. Figures moved with a cadence that betrayed organization. They had set up listen posts. They had run lines, and lights, small but there, blinked in a way that suggested someone with a generator and a will to keep it. A voice crackled over our little field radio, not mine, not Lena's. We were heard. The radio static tasted of cliff edge. We had been detected before we had a chance to see what Bluewell would give us freely. In the hush that followed, all the things we had talked about, trust, rationing, the scale of kindness and cruelty, felt suddenly sharp. We had a choice: reveal ourselves and bargain, or fade back and plan for another day. Either way, the problem had escalated. Bluewell was not just a rumor. It was a node, and nodes attract everything that moves in this new geography: helpful people, those who would be saved, and those who will take what's been saved. I think in the end, tension is a teacher. It shows you the brittle places in your plans. It pushes fatally at your assumptions. We had assumed rumors like Bluewell are either false or generous. We learned they are often both. We had hoped that a discovery might be the start of rebuilding. The world taught us that a discovery is always a test. Do you open the gate and share or close it and survive? We sat there as the sun found its voice, watching Bluewell's walls in a morning light that did not care for intentions. Around us, the truck's engine ticked like a small animal. There were choices to be made and lines to be drawn. For the first time since the first drought, I felt the old world in my bones, the terrible, human commerce of hope and violence. And I realized that the rising action was not just the weather or the raiders. It was everything that happens when possibility meets scarcity. We had crossed the first map line. The rest was anatomy, how to negotiate, how to fight, how to bargain, and how to live with the consequences of whichever door we opened. The decision would not be easy, and the cost would be counted in lives and in the metal taste of regret. The radio in my pack hummed, a thin tether to the place I had promised to return to. Lena's recorded voice would keep the night company for as long as the barrels lasted. We made a silent agreement. We would not go in hot. We would not reveal the full scope of what we had. We would wait until night and try to see who slept and who kept the pump. We would send Silas ahead as a scout. Mateo would be our bargaining presence. Lena would be the voice I could otherwise never be in the field. Steadier because she had less to lose in the short term. As we crept back into the scrub to make our plans, the ridge behind us rose like an accusation. Dust from the raider column lifted and drifted across the land like a slow, deliberate curtain. The world was fine-tuning itself into the shape of the next disaster. I kept my hand on the pocket where Mara's cap rested, as if its small blue stripe could somehow chart the path we were about to take. We were moving deeper into the middle of things now, into the rising action proper, where decisions multiply and the cost of error grows geometrically. There was no going back to the simple ledger of keep the transmitter alive and guard the rooftop garden. That ledger had erupted into a map with new axes, the possibility of a shared spring, the presence of organized defenders or threats, and the moral calculus of whether to fight for a place that might become a refuge, or to preserve our tiny radio island and the few faces who depended on it. Either way, the storm coming off the coast would not wait for us to decide, and the raiders on the ridge were already hunched like wolves over the bones of the road. They told us the storm would hit by dawn. They lied with the same delicate cruelty storms do. They arrived early, and with a violence no forecast could have held. The clouds that had been a bruise on the horizon became a wall that swallowed the moon. Wind rose like a living thing, and the first drops tasted like iron. We moved on the timetable we had made in whispers. Silas would go ahead and see who kept the pump. Mateo, and I would provide the muscle and negotiation. Lena would hold our line on the radio and keep the generator warm until we returned. We had cache of plans and a single thin ribbon of contingencies. Enough rope to climb out of a hole, or enough noose to strangle us with options. Silas slipped between the chain-link teeth around Bluewell and came back with a hand signal that meant people armed on watch. He had seen children, 2 small faces at a second-story slit, a woman knee-deep in pipes, a man with a wooden peg for a tooth tightening a clamp with a patience that made me ashamed of my own frantic hands. They were not a militia so much as they were a last-ditch municipal crew. A generator, a membrane filter rigged from parts no one in my town had ever thought to keep, and a network of pipes someone had welded into a makeshift distribution run. It smelled like sweat and the metallic breath of water. Negotiation began the way negotiations do in the New World, with distrust, then with numbers, then with a story to see if the other side shared the same version of humanity. Mateo spoke in a soft cadence of trade. We will give you the regulator from our truck. We will help clean the pre-filters. We will leave a cache of seeds if you promise to let others come for water at regulated times. The compound's leader, A woman with a bandana streaked gray sat on a crate and flung the end of a wrench in the way that said she had the patience to measure every promise. It felt like a small miracle that adult people could still do the mathematics of fairness. We had almost reached terms when the first echo of tires came across the ridge like a bad memory. Raiders. A long line of patched vehicles cut the high ground and then fell into the low. The pump man swore and went pale. He had men inside a stockade, but not enough bullets or time. Raids were efficient now. They came in with a plan, took what they needed, and left before the moral calculus could make itself felt. Go, I said, before I knew whether I meant it as an order to anyone but myself. Scatter, take the children, hide the lines, make the pump look broken. They moved like practice people, not because they had fought often, but because they had been frightened and had learned the geometry of fear. Children tucked under tarps, pipes disguised as dead limbs, valves covered with mud. For 3 minutes it all looked like ruins pretending not to be ruins. We had a single, thin edge. I could see the raider column coalescing around a larger vehicle, a rig that carried what looked like a mobile pump on its bed. They had come prepared to carry a waterworks away from a place that could not defend the full truth of itself. I could hear the faint chitter of their radios, the crack of voices with the self-satisfaction of men who believed the world owed them for being able to take. That is when the sky decided to unmake us. The wind got a bit meaner and the rain went from a hiss to a slap. It came in sheets, then ropes, then a curtain that glowed white under the lightning. The first great strike came down and the ground remembered how to run. Water that had sat patient for years found new paths and turned roads to rivers. The raiders, for all their preparation, began to curse and flounder. Their vehicles stalled in the mud like teeth in gum. The storm, for a moment, was its own jury. It could have been mercy, but storms are indifferent. As water ran into channels, it pushed at the old chemical caches that had been buried in a time before caution. Bluewell's intake was low, and it began to taste of things that should not be tasted. The membranes, delicate and precious, shuddered under the rush. If they tore and the well was flooded with runoff, the site would be rendered useless for weeks. If raiders got the mobile pump away, they would control the fountain and sell access like tolls at the gates of a dead empire. We were at the hinge of a knife. There was no clean way through. The defenders wanted to stand and fight. Mateo wanted to hold the truck as leverage. Silas wanted to smoke them out with explosives and see who fled. I could see Lena's voice across the distance, a thin thread in my mind, holding the transmitter back at the shack. I thought of the messages I had recorded, and of the names I repeat into the static every night. I thought of Mara's blue bottle cap in my pocket and how small it looked against all the sky. If I did nothing, the pump site might be taken or ruined. If I tried to fight them directly, we would lose more than water possibly lives. If I made a sound on the air, I would draw attention, but I could also redirect it. The ledger in my head counted options: casualties, fuel, trust, and the intangible value of being the voice that thrummed through people's nights. Then I remembered a trick, a stupid one I had learned when the generator first started to hiccup, and I had to coax power from its old lungs. The transmitter could be made directional if you paired it with the right antenna array. You could send a beacon that sounded as though it came from a different valley entirely. It would eat fuel, and it would burn the one thing I had been hoarding like a sanctity, the generator that fed my nightly station. But it might make the raiders move toward a false prize. It might buy the pump enough time to be made robust, or it might doom me. I am not a hero. I am a man who measures his guilt and finds ways to pay it forward in the currency he has. I made a choice. I handed Mateo my keys and told him to get any vulnerable people out and to hold the line by the south fence. I handed Silas a small satchel and told him to get the children to the culvert. Then I walked to the transmitter rack, put my hand on the warm metal casing, and thought of 1,000 small apologies. I tuned the antenna, braced it with sandbags, and cranked the generator to a last, hungry life. I cued a recording I had made earlier, a fake but convincing call about a cache of water and fuel 2 valleys over, with coordinates I had fabricated from an old highway sign and a child's map. I programmed the beacon, aimed the array away from Bluewell, and opened the mic. The recording looped, a desperate, promising voice calling for help, for pickup, for a convoy that would find treasure. Fuel slurped into the machine. The antenna sang. I was giving voice to a lie on purpose. It felt like a sacrament. Once the beacon had strength, I flipped the switch and carried the full sound of my voice across the hills. This is a distress call. Coordinates, the loop played again and again, like a moth calling to a porch light. For a long minute nothing happened. Then in the distance a line of headlamps peeled off from the radar formation like a school of fish and angled toward the fake coordinates. Men I had never met, hungry for bottles and pipes, turned themselves toward the sound of promise. The main radar column hesitated, then followed, greedous and unthinking. For a flicker of a human measure it worked. The storm's wail rose with the engine's cough. The rain smeared the beacon's reach. The antenna sang an ache that was more prayer than signal. I kept broadcasting because the alternative was to do nothing, and to watch people I had promised to protect be stripped of their water. I watched the raiders move away, a line of dark against the white, blinded by the weather and by the echo of false hope. It was not a clean victory. A scouting patrol broke off at the last minute and in the confusion of the storm sighted our truck. There was screaming, shots, and the sound of metal on metal. Mateo dove for a cartridge, and his shoulder took something hot that made him scream. Silas, who had been escorting the children, came running back, face ashen, dragging a small body, and for a moment I thought the world had finally broken. The children were nowhere to be seen and then reappeared, wet and dirty, led by a woman from the compound who had refused to let them go. I kept the loop going until the fuel light bled to empty, and then I cranked by hand, arm muscles burning, skin slick with rain and salt. Hands grabbed and helped. The pump man reappeared and added his shoulder to the crank. We did not do this for glory. We did it because someone had to make the sound of a prize and someone else had to be stupid enough to follow it. When the last turn of the crank died, the beacon fell silent. The radar line that had gone after it had found nothing but silt and a rusted vending machine. The main column, confused and weather-beaten, had been delayed. With that delay, the defenders at Bluewell had sealed valves, bled the intake of the first, poisonous runoff, and swapped membranes with Mateo's team while I held a flashlight with my teeth and passed them wrenches. It was ugly and sanctified at once. The storm did not stop because we turned the world's attention for a while. It only grew more insistent. Floodwater fought against the barricades. At one point, a slab of concrete dislodged and slid into the intake. We waded in the muck to wrest it free. Our hands were small, our tools smaller, but the rhythm of work, a thing older than optimism, took over. There were screams when a makeshift fence gave way and raiders tried to return, found blocked paths, and were scattered by the rain into a chaos I can only call mercy. When the sky finally loosened its hold sometime after dawn, the world smelled like iron and possibility. The pump had been saved, and a filter, fragile and patched, pushed clean water into a container that tasted like light. People wept when they tasted it. Mateo's wound throbbed, but he made jokes through gritted teeth. Silas sat on an overturned crate and cursed his luck in a dozen languages. He had earned the right to be angry and to be awake. And me. I sat on a step with my palms blistered from cranking, and my jacket soaked through. The generator lay quiet, its fuel line dry and its belly empty. I had burned the heart of what kept me a night voice for the sake of a well that might birth a new net of life. The ledger in my head balanced in an odd way. Water for strangers, silence for my city. It would have been easy to imagine the radio quiet forever as a punishment. But then Lena's recorded voice, the one I had left to hold the night, crackled into my ear through a hand-held unit Mateo had handed me. She had managed to keep the frequency alive on a tiny battery, and the message she had been repeating, my signature, my reassurance, was still finding ears in the night. "Hold on," she said, with the same cadence I had practiced. "Hold on until we can turn the tank." I looked at the Blue Well crew, at the children blinking in a new light, at the man with the peg tooth who had fixed a valve with nothing but a prayer and a welding torch. I felt a familiar thing ripple through me, a sorrow and a small, sharp pride. I had traded my nightly voice for a chance at a communal spring. I had not paid for it with my life, only with a promise I would have to keep in other ways. The cost of the choice sat in my chest like metal. There would be consequences. Word of Blue Well would spread, and some of it would bring salvation, and some of it would bring predators. We had delayed disaster. We had not ended it. I had chosen a thorny, complicated path. I had believed, irrationally and perhaps rightly, that hands that pump water together will also find the courage to teach each other how to keep it. When I finally spoke on the radio that afternoon, using a rig scavenged from the compound, and a battery charged in a last-fit scramble, my voice was raw. I did not say that I had done the heroic thing. I simply said what I could not stop telling myself. We have water at Blue Well. We held it through the storm. Come in daylight, bring barter, and speak through the gate. We will share, but we will not be taken. It was not a proclamation. It was a beginning. As the rain thinned and the skies eased their fists, I realized the turning point had not been the storm, nor the raiders, nor the crank of a tired generator. It had been the moment when I chose, publicly, selfishly, and with a trembling nobility, to risk my one sureness for something larger than myself. That was the hinge from which everything might swing toward ruin or toward repair. As we packed to leave and to return to the little radio shack that had been my life, I pocketed Mara's blue cap and felt the small, stubborn truth settle into place. Hope is not a thing you find. It is a thing you choose to make, over and over, in the middle of ruin. When the worst of the rain eased and the raiders were a memory rearranged into tracks, the first small miracle was simply tasting water that did not make my mouth ache. We drank standing in a ring around a plastic barrel, hands cupped like children. The taste was thin and honest, not like a banquet but like the word maybe. People wept quietly. Someone laughed. A child asked if the water could sing, and we all pretended for a minute that it could. Blue Well survived the storm because a handful of us chose to make noise in the right place at the right time, and because the people who lived there had the stubborn competence to hide and to fix what needed fixing. We paid for it in a dozen small ways. Mateo's shoulder would never be the same. There was a limp in his walk that hadn't been there before. The generator I'd burned down to an ember was beyond my promise to coax. It was a dead heart. Lena kept the frequency alive with nothing more than a battery and a couple of small panels scavenged from the compound. She would send the tapes I'd left until she grew thin with worry. People applauded her voice in the same way they had applauded mine, because a voice is a light that refuses to die easily. The immediate outcome was both obvious and complicated. Blue Well became a place that had water and the machinery to push it through pipes, which meant hope and it meant obligation. News traveled the way news does now, clumsy, deliberate, and dangerous. Word of clean water is not like a whisper. It is a bell. Within 2 weeks we had visitors who came with proper trade, seeds, tools, a crate of iodine, and visitors who came with other designs. We had mediators from a nearby enclave who wanted a formal arrangement. We had a man who came at night and offered protection for a price. We had a woman who taught us how to graft a new variety of heat-hardy bean. We also had the moral calculus that never resolves itself. Blue Well could feed dozens, perhaps hundreds, if we built a system that distributed water fairly. But building that system required more than pipes. It required trust, a framework, and people willing to keep hours on the wall. We wrote a schedule on a board salvaged from a shuttered school. Hours for villagers, hours for travelers, time windows for deliveries. We instituted a barter rate that favored labor over hardware. Hours working on the pump bought you a share, not sacks of grain bought you control. I argued for transparency. Others argued for a locked gate and passwords. We split the difference and then watched the seams. People judged me for what I had done. Some called the beacon a miracle and my deceit a necessary sacrament. Others called it manipulation and said I had painted a target on a place that would have been better hidden. When a woman on the air accused me of grandstanding, her voice broke in a way that let in all the things a radio cannot show. Fear, suspicion, a lifetime of being taught that anyone who speaks promises is someone to be watched. I do not pretend I sleep easily. I replay the moment I keyed the transmitter and hear the hiss of the generator like an old confession. But then I listen to the child who no longer coughs through the night, and I know the ledger is not a clean thing where every entry has a moral correspondent. The world does not give receipts for bravery. The environment did not decide to be kinder because one pump survived. The hills still smelled of ash months after the rain. The riverbeds filled with silt, and the grass that returned was coarse and thin. But there were threads of recovery if you were patient enough to see them. A fringe of green along the base of the intake where algae had not yet learned to become poison. A patch of moss under a shaded valve. A stubborn sprout through a crack in the concrete near the pump house. Nature, always indifferent, moves in fits. We saw hints that where water is steady, life will edge back. But steady requires maintenance and protection, and that is the human work we now measure ourselves against. What changed inside me was not a triumphant revelation, but a shift of the center of gravity. I had always thought my job was to be a voice, to keep the night tethered to names and warnings. That is still true, in a way, but crises have a way of bulldozing tidy identities. After Bluewell, I understood that voices and pumps are two halves of the same fight. You can speak courage into the dark, but you also have to stand in the mud when the slab gets stuck and crank the valve with numb fingers. Leadership in this world is both microphone and callous. So I made a list of things to do, practical things, because I am a man who measures guilt and pays it forward in chores. We needed redundancy. A hand crank pump for Bluewell in case a generator died. Solar trickle chargers to feed a battery the size of a lunchbox. A cache of charcoal filters and some sewing kits so that clothes could be mended. A rota for night watches that rotated not by force but by shared reward. More watch hours earned more allotment. We started training people on the basic mechanics of the pump, on testing water with the simplest of tools, on how to boil a sample and look for strange residues. We taught kids the code for when to shut the intake if the runoff turned chemical. Education is slow work. It will likely outlast me. The radio, the thing I had given up for Bluewell, became a problem I could no longer ignore. Lena's battery would not last forever, and the generator at the shack was beyond my small miracles. So we made a plan. Bluewell would host a micro station, cheap panels, small batteries, a hand-crank generator for emergencies that could keep a local frequency alive. We would create a relay system, a chain of low-power transmitters that could pass messages across the valley without requiring a single, easily targeted tower. It is not glamorous, but in an age when a single array can make you a target, small and distributed is how you survive. We taught 2 teenagers how to solder and how to read a signal. I taught them shorthand and a way to speak into a mic so that their voices could be a tether for somebody else across the hills. If the world needed a storyteller, it also needed technicians who could keep the microphone from going dark. The social architecture after Bluewell showed its flaws quickly. Some people wanted to hoard the knowledge of the membranes and sell access to the highest bidder. Others wanted to publish coordinates and invite anyone who came. We argued, fought, not with guns but with songs and with forged signatures, and then agreed on a middle path. Regulated access, shared labor, and penalties for stealing. The penalties were social more than punitive, shunning, refusal of trade, the slow economic death of being cut loose from a network you could not rejoin. It is a brittle form of law, but it is human, and humans still care when others look away. I changed in smaller, less tectonic ways, too. I stopped romanticizing the person I used to be, the man who had a neat job and clean shirts. Those things are not only gone, They are sentimental luxuries. I learned hobbies that double as survival skills. Mending cokes with wire stripped from heater coils, grafting tomatoes for heat, and telling a story in a way that nudged someone toward a task rather than a panic. I learned how to take orders without letting my ego make them into sermons. I learned that being small and useful sometimes matters more than being loud and right. And still, regret is a persistent tenet. There are faces I do not see anymore. There are nights where guilt sits on my chest like a stone I cannot name. I told someone in the compound the truth about the fake coordinates and waited for them to spit at me. They did not. They understood, not because they had the language of law or morality, but because they had the language of survival. We had done wrong and we had done right, often in the same breath. The radio had become a tool of both salvation and manipulation, and I am learning to live inside that duality. Months after the storm, Bluewell is a hub that teaches as much as it supplies. People come with knowledge instead of goods. A woman who knows how to knit a filter sock from hemp, an elder who remembers an old trick to clear silt, a man who can bend metal to make a new crank. We have also had fights, ugly ones, over distribution and promises unmet. But every fight is a proof that people care. A corpse does not argue over water. A living thing does. In the quiet moments, I go back to the little rituals that keep my heart from being entirely practical. I sit by the pump house at dusk and watch the light thin, and I take Mara's blue bottle cap from my pocket and hold it up so that the children can see the stripe. I tell them a small story about a girl who liked planets. They listen with the appetite of people who hunger for anything that points to continuity. Sometimes they ask if Mara would have laughed at a joke or if she would have liked their hair. I do not tell them the full truth. I tell them that she would have been impatient with sorrow and would have made them hot chocolate if she could. It is a lie that is loving. The radio finally came back to me in a way I did not expect. It was not the same powerful transmitter I had in the tower. It was a ragged-edged chain of cheap panels and a battery that hummed like a sleeping bird. Lena and the teenagers kept it alive, and in the pockets of morning and dusk, I would speak into it and hear voices return. Some were gratitude-ridden, some accusing, some practical. A woman wrote in with seeds. A man called in from the north asking for help with a child's fever. We answer as best we can. The voice is the same and not the same. It has been tempered. If the night that erased tomorrow taught me anything, it was that tomorrows are not erased for everyone at once. They are chipped away, one decision at a time, and sometimes they are rebuilt in inconvenient pieces. There is no grand reset coming. There are only small decisions made with muddy hands. I chose, in the middle of ruin, to turn my voice into a tool for a place that needed water more than it needed a microphone. I lost the ease of speaking into a warm transmitter with a hum, and I gained the knowledge that being useful looks a lot like getting your hands dirty. So I live now between two things, the call to speak and the call to act. I will go back to the shack some nights to tell the usual stories, warnings, trade announcements, the names of people who have passed through, and then I will go back to Bluewell to teach a child how to clean a membrane. I will keep the radio singing because voices matter, but I will no longer mistake being a voice for being a leader. Leadership is often a dirty daily thing. On nights when the wind is kind and the sky is clean for a few breaths, I tie Mara's blue cap to a spike by the intake. It is small, ridiculous, and utterly human. It flaps in the small breeze, a color against the gray, an insistence that someone lived and that someone loved, and that we are still, absurdly and stubbornly, choosing to hold on. There is no grand finale to a world that broke slowly. No trumpets, no curtain call. The thing that happens instead, and this is the truth I've carried home like a loaf under my arm, is that you keep doing the small, particular work of being alive. You stitch a seam here, you teach a child to splice wire there, you trade a day's labor for a jar of iodine, and you sleep with your ear to the ground. That is how tomorrows get saved now. Not by a single miracle, but by an accumulation of small mercies. Bluewell is quieter these nights. The pump sings in short, economical bursts. We keep the intake blindly monitored now, a schedule on a board, watches rotated so no one person bears every night. The raiders are still out there. The storm cycles are still perverse. The generator that used to feed my tower is a dead thing, a lesson I learned in gasoline and regret. But the thing that surprised me, the thing that unclenched my chest a fraction, was how many people came with hands ready to work rather than hands ready to take. A teacher from the West taught the children basic hygiene and the way to boil a sample. An old welder came with a slapdash plan for a crank that will outlast 8 storms. We make lists and we cross things off. We mourn the ones who did not make the list because mourning keeps names alive. Hope is a brittle thing. It snaps when you brag it too loudly. It softens when you feed it crumbs of truth and labor. I watch the children learn to sew a filter sock and my hope grows, not into certainty, but into a slow, stubborn resilience. It is a patience disguised as a small machine, a hand crank that needs 2 people to turn, a child learning to lean into the rhythm, an old woman teaching a teenager how to clean a membrane. There is no poetry in it for most of us, only the plain, fierce satisfaction of work that keeps a throat from going dry. I have choices that are permanent now. I can return to my tower if a donor drum of fuel appears and restart the broad signal that once stitched together county lines. I can choose to remain at Bluewell and help build a distributed relay network so no single tower paints a target on our backs. I choose the relay, the slow multiplication of small stations run on panels and crank batteries and children with soldering irons. It is less glamorous and it is safer. It is also, in the long arithmetic of survival, smarter. There are nights when the guilt arrives like a guest who refuses to go home. I burn the generator to save a pump. That is a fact with an edge. I own it. I confess it into the microphone, now not to absolve myself. There is no absolution in a world that asks such costs, but because naming the ledger keeps me honest. The community made me accountable. We set rules about access and about penalties for theft that are not murderous but are sure. Shunning, loss of trade, the social death that comes with isolation. Those measures feel crude, but they have teeth and they have saved more than once. Nature, in its own indifferent way, offers small recompenses. The first summer after the storm, a fringe of sedge returned along a dry channel near the intake. It was not a meadow, it was a hint. When water is steady, even imperfectly, life begins to edge back. Birds came to the barrels and drank as if the world were a place that might keep its promises. That is the kind of hope that is not ideological, it is empirical. Put water where it will be protected and life will come. Protect it poorly, and predators will take notice. If there is one thing I have learned to say plainly on the air, it is this. Do the little things that keep other people alive. Teach someone how to test water with a cloth and a boil. Keep a spare filter in a known cache. Rotate watch schedules so exhaustion does not make the best of us into the worst. Share the knowledge of how to fix a pump, not just the pump itself. Make your networks redundant. Do not put all your letters in one mailbox. The physics of this new climate are indifferent. Storms will come. Floods will redistribute poisons. Droughts will hang like threats. But the human protocols we build around resilience can blunt the worst of it. I spend less time on the air and more time in the muck, but I still speak. My voice is different now, less a comfort for its own sake and more a tool. I announce schedules, I teach, I read names. At dusk I read the list of those we have lost and those we have welcomed, because the act of naming is small resistance against erasure. Lena runs the mic when I am in the field. She has learned to hold the line, to be the steady voice. I have trained 2 teenagers on soldering and 3 more on how to test for nitrates. If I die tomorrow, someone will be able to keep the frequency alive in a way I could not have imagined a year ago. The final message I want to leave on the air, and I repeat it because repetition is how trust is built, is simple. Hold on, but prepare to act. Hope without plans is a weak thing. Planning without hope is only procedure. You need both. A current of practical knowledge and the stubborn sense that tomorrow might care enough to exist. Learn to make a filter. Keep a spare sail of tarp. Teach a child how to read a weather line in the sky. Store water in more than one place. Build community with people who have hands, not just mouths. We are not building an empire. We are building a patchwork, a network of small stations that trade, teach, and watch. We trade in tools and trust, and we punish breaches with the only currency we all still care about: inclusion. Inclusion means food, water, exchange. Exclusion means you wither in the margins until you become an anecdote others tell to prove their point. I will take the messy ethics of keeping someone alive over the clean certainty of being right any day. In the end, the night that erased tomorrow did not finish us. It trimmed us into something leaner and harder to predict. It made us learn trade-offs in a way that a long peace never would. It also taught me, painfully, that being the voice in the dark is not enough. Voices must anchor themselves in action. I gave up my nightly tower so a pump could sing. That trade will keep a child's throat from soreness for a season or two. It will also make us work and argue and mend. If you are listening, whoever you are, wherever you are, take one thing from me. Do something small today that will matter tomorrow. Teach a neighbor to boil water. Fix a joint. Hide a spare filter. Write a list of names of those who depend on you and the things they need. When the storm comes, it will ask for only what you have prepared to give. That is both the cruelest and kindest of facts. So I will sign off because sign-offs matter now. I will leave the mic to Lena for the late hours. I will go patch a leak, and tomorrow I will teach a kid how to wind a crank. The world is not fixed. It will demand new reckonings and new sacrifices. But as long as we choose, again and again, to share not just goods but knowledge and labor, we keep the possibility of another morning from being an accident. This is Jonah Rays, speaking from a place that still pumps and a radio that still listens. Hold on. Help someone tomorrow. Say the names of those you lost and the names of those you will protect. Keep the small machines working. Keep the stories alive.